Chapter 19 Nanogen Headquarters 29 October 2:30 p.m. Then Drake crossed the parking lot, moving toward Telius and Johnstone, who waited between two cars at the edge of the lot. Better to talk outdoors. Anything you said could be heard, recorded, preserved. He had to keep track of the details. Details are evidence. Evidence could escape. Evidence could fly out into the world. You could lose control of it. We've had a breach of security, Drake said to the two men. Tilius stood with his shaved head bent, listening. A short, wiry man with fierce, restless eyes that darted over the ground, as if he was searching for some small object he'd lost. Johnstone, much taller than Telius, wore sunglasses and stood at ease, with his hands behind his back. A tattoo on Johnstone's scalp shone through a fade haircut. Drake went on. We are dealing with industrial spies. They could destroy Nanogen. We believe these spies are working for a foreign government. As you may know, there are certain classified activities at Nanogen that unfriendly governments would very much like to know about. We don't know anything about that, Telius said. That's correct, Drake said. You don't. Somebody drove by and parked their car, and Drake paused. He and the two men turned away and walked along the edge of the parking lot, saying nothing for a few moments, waiting for the persons to go inside the building. The trade wind rattled the seed pods of acacia shrubs growing in the empty lot nearby. Drake turned and gazed at the metal building. That building doesn't look like much, but in the near future, the business inside it will be worth at least $100 billion. $100 billion? He paused to let the number sink in. Incredible wealth will be created for the lucky people who owned ground floor shares in Nanogen. He squinted into the sunlight, then looked sideways at the two men. You know what ground floor shares are, right? The owners of ground floor shares can sell their shares for a spectacular profit when the company goes public in an IPO. Did they see where he was going with this? Their faces revealed precisely nothing. No thought, no emotion. Nothing to be read or inferred. Professional faces, he thought. Drake continued. I want you to go into the micro world on a rescue mission to find the spies. I'll give you a full movement kit, a hexapod and weapons. Anything you need. The spies were dropped, are believed to have been lost in an area about 20 meters radius around Supply Station Echo. So I want you to begin your search at Echo. It's possible the missing persons are following the micro trails, looking for supply stations in order to take refuge in them. The supply stations have all been removed, all except for Station Kilo. We couldn't find Station Kilo. You are to follow the networks of trails moving from the site of one station to the next, searching for the spies. And how to put this clearly so there would be no mistake. You will find the missing people, but here's the point. The rescue will fail. Understand? Despite your best efforts, the spies will not be found. I don't want to know anything about how you do it. The spies have to disappear. But I don't want to hear any rumors about what happened to them either. If no trace of them is found, there will be a reward. Drake put his hands in his pockets and felt the wind kissing his face. Failure, he added saucily, is the only option. He turned around and looked at the two men. He saw nothing there. The men's faces held no expression. A small bird whipped past and landed in the acacia bushes. If the rescue effort fails, the reward for each of you will be 1 share of Nanogen's ground floor stock. When Nanogen goes public, a single share will be worth at least $1 million. Get it? The men just looked at him with eyes as flat as the parking lot. But they got it. He was sure of that. You're venture capitalists now, Drake said, slapping Telius on the shoulder as he left. The rain ended as quickly as it had begun. A steamy golden glow filled the forest as the clouds broke, and the water quickly receded as the rivulets emptied, and the rain ran off into the stream that drained the Manor Valley. They had lost a lot of their gear, scattered by the water, and Jenny had disappeared. They collected it themselves together in a group, and when everyone was accounted for, they spread out looking for the gear and, most of all, for Jenny. They went downhill, following the water flow, using the 2 headset radios to keep in touch. "Jenny, are you there? Jenny," they shouted. But there was no answer, and no sign of her. "I found the harpoon," Rick said. It hadn't traveled far. His darts had been in a plastic case inside his duffel bag, and the bag turned up wedged against a stone. Even the china berry was found, underneath the edge of a leaf, glowing yellow. Karen King moved along with a sense of dread as they searched for Jenny Lynn. She was shaking. She had seen the look on Jen's face when she went down that last time. The worst horrors are the human ones. What had Jenny seen? Then King spotted something pale, soft, draped under a twig. A human hand. She had found Jenny. Her body was pinned under the twig, crushed and oddly twisted, and speckled with mud. With the forsaken look of the drowned, her broken arm flung akimbo and contorted, like a wet rag. Jen's eyes were open, vacant. Her body was covered with spaghetti-like threads, which crisscrossed and draped her like a veil. They were threads of fungus, already beginning to grow. Kieran knelt by the body and pulled a thread from Jen's face and closed Jen's eyes and wept. The others gathered around. Rick found himself weeping, and it embarrassed him. He tried to control his tears, but it didn't work. Peter put his arm around Rick, and Rick shook him off. "I tried so hard," Danny said, and cried. "I just couldn't save her." Erica enfolded Danny in her arms. "You are a brave man, Danny. I never realized it until now." There was a creaking sound. The veil of fungus threads that covered Jen's body seemed to twitch. "What was that?" Erica said, and her eyes widened with horror as she saw a thread of fungus bend and wave like a crooked finger, and the tip of the thread touched Jen's skin. It went in through the skin, making a scratchy sound, piercing the body, probing for nutrients. The fungus veil had already begun to consume the body. Erica cringed and stood up. Peter spoke. "We need to bury her, quickly." Using the harpoon and the machetes, they hacked apart the soil. It was soft and rich, and alive with small creatures moving and squirming. The soil was almost a living organism in its own right. The only non-living thing was seemingly Jenny. They lowered her into the grave they dug and crossed her arms over her chest. Arranging the broken arm, they tried to clear the fungus off her, but the threads had tightened, clamping themselves to the body, penetrating it everywhere. Erica Mole wept uncontrollably. Peter cut a part of a petal from a fallen hibiscus flower lying on the ground, and he laid the piece of petal over Jenny like a white shroud. It covered the activity of the fungus beneath it. Then Erica suggested that they say a prayer. She wasn't a religious person. At least she didn't think she was. But she had been raised a Catholic and had been taught by nuns in a nursery school in Munich. The nuns had taught her how to say the 23rd Psalm in German. Der Herr ist mein Hirte. Erica began, haltingly, trying to remember it. Peter picked it up in English. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." "Magical incantations," Danny commented. "The words have no reference to so-called reality, but possibly they help us in a psychological way. I suspect praying stimulates primitive parts of the brain. Actually, it even makes me feel a little better." Then they piled soil on top of Jenny. The body would not last long, and would soon be consumed by the fungus and nematode worms. It would be digested by bacteria and devoured by the soil mites that crawled everywhere. Soon there would be no trace of Jenny Lynn left in the soil. Her remains swallowed and recycled. Her body returned to the to the bodies of other creatures. In the microworld, no sooner had life ended than it became life again. Afterward, Peter gathered the group and spoke to them, trying to rally their spirits. Jenny wouldn't want us to give up. She went on bravely. We can honor her by looking to our own survival now. They assembled the backpacks and the 2 duffel bags. They couldn't linger at Jenny's grave. They had to keep moving toward the parking lot. The lab notebook containing the map hadn't been lost. Kieran had tucked it into the backpack. They took it out. It was crumbling, mushy, soaked, but they could still read the map. It showed a trail or path running from Station Echo to Station Delta, and finally to Alpha by the parking lot. They had a lot to travel ahead of them. We don't know if any of the stations remain, but we can still follow the trail. If we can find it, Kieran said. They couldn't find any sort of trail. The rain had altered the landscape, shifting debris all around, cutting new channels in the soil. Peter took out the compass and studying the hand-drawn map, he sighted a line toward the parking lot. They began walking with Peter, leading the way, cutting a path with a machete. Karen stepped along behind him, carrying the harpoon across her shoulder. Rick Hutter brought up the rear, silent and wary, holding a machete ready for action. Danny kept stopping to rest. "Don't your feet hurt?" Peter asked him. "What do you think?" Danny muttered. "We could make you some shoes." "It's hopeless," Danny said. "But we must try," Erica said to him. "I tried so hard to save Jenny." Peter cut up strips of dead grass, while Erica wrapped Danny's feet in the grass, making rough moccasins out of the grass strips. Emma remembered the duct tape he had found at Station Echo. He dug it out of a duffel bag and began winding strips of tape around Danny's grass moccasins to hold them on his feet. Danny stood up and took a few steps in his duct tape grass mocks. They were surprisingly tough and remarkably comfortable. A thudding noise drifted high overhead, sounding strangely like a helicopter. A mosquito appeared. It soared downward out of the trees and dodged around them. Despite its large size, the mosquito held itself effortlessly suspended in the air on its beating wings, and it seemed to be studying them. It had a black and white striped body and striped legs. A long proboscis hung from its head. They could see twin razor-sharp cutting blades at the tip of the proboscis. The blades were caked with dried blood. The mosquito's blood-sucking tools looked sharp enough to stab straight through the body of a microhuman. Danny Mannett lost his nerve. "Get away!" he shouted at the mosquito, and ran, waving his arms and shuffling in his moccasins. Perhaps attracted to Danny's motion, or perhaps to his scent, the mosquito chased after him, hovering just above his neck. Without warning, it dove down, almost spearing him between the shoulders with its proboscis. Danny flung himself to the ground and rolled over on his back, kicking his legs in the air. "Get off me!" The mosquito buzzed over him and lunged at him again until Karen King leaped on top of Danny's, straddling him and waving her machete, trying to scare off the mosquito. It didn't scare easily. "Form up," Peter shouted. "Make a defensive circle." The humans formed themselves into a defensive ring around Danny, who lay on the ground in terror. They faced outward with their machetes, held ready, watching the mosquito while it circled around them. The mosquito evidently smelled their blood, and may also have sensed the carbon dioxide they gave off as they breathed. It darted in and out, seeming to stare at them with goggly eyes, its proboscis dangling. "Uh-oh," Erkamol said. "What?" "It's a female Aedes, albopictus." "Meaning," Danny said, lurching to his knees, "an Asian tiger mosquito. The females are aggressive, and they carry diseases." Rick Heiser grabbed Karen King by the arm. "Give me that harpoon." "Hey," she said, whirling on him, but he snatched the harpoon from her. Rick advanced towards the mosquito, raising the harpoon. "Be patient, Rick," Peter said. "Wait for an opening." The mosquito darted in towards Rick. He saw his chance. He whirled the harpoon using it like a stick, and rocked the mosquito across the head with it. "Go pick on someone bigger than you," Rick yelled. The mosquito thundered off, wobbling in the air. Killer King began to laugh. "What's so funny?" Rick ripped at her. "The mosquitoes ran you back to your hotel in Costa Rica. You've come a long way, Rick." "That's not funny," he said to her. "Give me that back," she said, grabbing the harpoon from him. They got into a tug-of-war over the harpoon. Karen won. She yanked the harpoon away from Rick, who swore at her. Karen couldn't take that. She lost it. She stepped toward Rick, pointing the harpoon at his face. "Don't use a word like that with me." "Whoa now," Rick backed away, holding up his hands. Karen flung the harpoon at Rick's feet. "Take it." Peter stepped between them. "We're a team. Hey, you two have to stop fighting with each other." Karen smoldered. "I wasn't fighting with Rick. If I was, he'd be holding his softies and puking his guts out." Peter Jansen stayed out front, picking the route, cutting tirelessly at obstacles with the machete, and pausing every now and then to sharpen the blade with a diamond sharpener. The blade could cut anything as long as its edge was maintained. He tried to keep everybody's spirits up. "Do you know what Robert Louis Stevenson said about travel?" he said, calling back to the others. He said, "It is better to journey hopefully than to arrive." "Fuck hope. I'll settle for arrival," Danny Manott remarked. As he marched along at the back of the line, Rickhardt glanced at the others, studying them. He considered Karen King. He really couldn't stand her. She was full of herself, arrogant, aggressive, thinking she was such an expert in spiders and arachnids, and hand-to-hand combat. She was good-looking, but beauty wasn't everything. Even so, Rick felt somewhat better that Karen was with the group. She was a fighter. You could say that much for her. Right now, she seemed icy, cold, alert, on edge, weighing every move, as if she was in a fight for her life. Well, of course she was. He despised her, and yet he was glad to have Karen around. Next, Rick studied Erica Mole. She walked along pale, frightened. Erica was holding herself together on the edge of some kind of emotional crack-up. The fungus devouring Jen's body. This had gotten to Erica, Rick thought. If Erica didn't pull herself together, she might be doomed. But you could say just which of the humans possessed the strength and cunning to get out alive from this kingdom of tiny horrors. As for Amar Singh, Rick thought, he seemed resigned to this fate, as if he'd already decided he was going to die. Danny Manott trudged along in his duct-tape slippers. That guy is tougher than he looks, Rick thought, watching Danny. He could be a survivor. Rick looked at Peter Jansen. How did Peter do it? He seemed so calm, almost gentle, at peace with himself, in some deep way Rick couldn't fathom. Peter Jansen had become a true leader, and it fit him well. It was as if Peter had come into his own in the micro world. There was Rick Carter himself. Rick was not a reflective person. He rarely thought about himself, but he did now. Something strange was happening to him, and he couldn't quite understand it. He felt okay. Why? He wondered. Did he feel okay? I should feel terrible. Jenny is dead. Kinski got ripped by ants. Who's next? But this was the expedition Rick Hyder had always dreamed of, yet never thought possible. A journey into the hidden heart of nature, into a world of unseen wonders. In all likelihood, he would die on this crest. Nature was not gentle or nice. There was no such thing as mercy in the natural world. You don't get any points for trying. You either survive or you don't. Maybe none of us will make it. He wondered if he would vanish here, in a small valley on the outskirts of Honolulu, swallowed up in a labyrinth of threats almost beyond imagining. Got to keep going, Rick thought. be smart, be clever, get through the eye of the needle. After what seemed like miles of walking, Rick noticed a strange, bittersweet smell drifting in the air. What was it? He looked up and saw tiny white flowers overhead, scattered like stars through a tree that had snaky limbs and smooth silver-gray bark. The odor of the flowers resembled semen, but with a nasty edge of something harmful. Yes, Nux vomica. Rick called to the others to stop. Wait a minute, guys. I found something. He knelt by a gnarled root, which poked from the ground. It's a Straxine tree, he said to the group. With his machete, he began hacking at the root, until he'd revealed a strip of inner bark, which he chopped out, looking carefully with the machete. This bark, he explained, contains brucine. It's a drug that induces paralysis. I would have preferred the seeds, because they are incredibly toxic, but the bark will do. Handling the bark carefully, trying not to get any sap on his hands, he tied a rope to the bark and started dragging it along behind him. We can't put this in my pack. It would poison everything, Rick explained. That bark is dangerous, Karen said. You're right, Karen. It's going to get us food, and I'm hungry. Erica stood aside and sniffed the air, watching, keeping alert for the warning smell of ants. The air felt slightly heavy as it went in and out of her lungs. Everywhere she looked, every crack and cranny in the soil, every blade of grass, every little ground-hugging plant teemed with small living things, insects, mites, nematode worms. And she could actually see masses of soil bacteria, tiny dots and clumps. Everything was alive. Everything was feeding on something else. It reminded her she had begun to feel really hungry. They were ravenously hungry, but had nothing to eat. They drank water from a hole in a tree root and moved on. Rick dragging the piece of bark. We have suctionine and we have the chinaberry, he said, but it's not enough. We need at least one more ingredient. He kept looking around, scanning the vegetation for plants he recognized, for anything toxic, and eventually he found what he was looking for. He discovered it by scent. He recognized a sharp odor coming from a mass of vegetation. Olander, Rick said, and he went toward a mass of shrubbery with long, pointed, shiny leaves. The sap is the wicked stuff. Crashing through leaf litter, he arrived at the trunk of the shrub. He drew his machete, sharpened it, and hacked into the trunk. A translucent, milky sap surged forth, while Rick backed away quickly. That liquid will kill you fast if it touches your skin. It's got a lethal mix of cardenolides in it. It'll stop your heart. Bam. You don't want to breathe the fumes either. The fumes could give you a heart attack. While the sap oozed down the bark, Rick rummaged in his duffel, and he put on the lab apron and the rubber gloves and goggles he'd found on Station Echo. Emma grinned. Rick, you look like a mad scientist. Madness is my style, Rick said. He opened one of the plastic lab jars and advanced toward the running sap. Holding his breath, he let the jar fill up while the sap dripped over his gloves. He screwed on the cap, then rinsed the outside of the jar in a drop of dew. He filled a second jar the same way, and held up both jars with a triumphant smile. Now what we need to do is cook everything into a paste. For that we need a fire. But the forest was soaking wet after the rain. Nothing would burn. No problem, Rick said. All we need is Alirite's Molicana. What the hell is that, Rick? Karen King said. It's a candle nut tree, he answered. The Hawaiians call them kukri trees. There are kukri trees growing all over this forest. He stopped and looked up and turned around, staring upward. Yeah, that's a kukri right there. He pointed at a tree with large silvery leaves. The tree stood out like a pale thunderhead 10 meters away. It was hung with greenish balls of fruit. They pressed on towards the candlenut tree. When they reached its base, they saw pulpy fruits scattered on the ground around the tree. Let me have a machete, Rick said. Now watch. He began hacking into a fruit, chopping off the pulp using the machete. Soon he reached a nut. That's a kukri nut, he said. The nut is loaded with oil. The ancient Hawaiians filled stone lamps with kukri nut oil. It's a great source of light. They also put the nuts on a stick and used it as a torch. The nut burns. The kukri nut, covered with a glossy hard shell, proved difficult to crack. However, they took turns chopping away at it with a machete. The weapon had a heavy blade and an exceedingly sharp edge, and it cut slowly into the nut shell. A few minutes of chopping revealed the oily nut meat. They began hacking out chunks of the nut, and they made a pile of the nut meat on the ground. They added husks of dry grass, which Peter peeled out of the center of dead grass stems, which had stayed dry despite the rain. Rick set his metal pot on top of the nut pieces and put on his chemical equipment. He adjusted his goggles and loaded the pot with strips of stringyxine root bark, chunks of the china berry, the 2 jugs of Olander sap, and water collected from the top of a leaf. Rick lit the fire with a windproof lighter. The tinder began to burn, and the cookery nut fire blazed up, yellow and bright. It was a small fire by the standards of the normal world, not much bigger than a candle flame. Yet to them it seemed like a bonfire. The fire heated their faces and made them blink and shy away. And it brought the water in the pot to a boil within seconds. 2 minutes of boiling time was enough to reduce the contents of the pot to a terry goo. Fresh Carrera, Rick said. Let's hope anyway. Looking carefully with a splinter of wood, wearing rubber gloves and holding his breath, Rick packed the Kara into a plastic lab bottle. He could dip his dots in the stuff to arm them with poison. He hoped the goop was poisonous, but he wouldn't know for certain until he used it in a hunting situation. He screwed the top on the bottle, then lifted the goggles from his eyes and parked them on his forehead. Peter stared at Rick's plastic bottle and the brown-colored gunk in it. So you think that'll take down big game? Something as big as a grasshopper? He asked. Rick offered him a wry smile. It's not finished. How so? We need one more ingredient, which is cyanide. What? Peter said, while the others gathered around listening. You heard me. Cyanide, Rick said, and I know where to get it. Where? Peter wondered. An answer. Rick turned his head around slowly. I can smell it. Hydrogen cyanide, also known as prussic acid. That riff of bitter almonds. Can you smell it? Cyanide, a universal poison. It'll kill practically anything and fast. Cyanide, a favorite of Cold War spies. Get this. There's an animal around here that makes cyanide. It's probably hiding under a leaf. Probably asleep. The others stared while Rick set out through the super jungle, stopping occasionally to sniff the air. Following his nose, he started turning over leaves, dragging them with both hands. The smell grew stronger. It tickled their noses now. Once Rick had pointed it out to them, he stuck his head under a leaf. Got it, he whispered. Under the leaf, a brownish, oily, jointed carapace gleamed, along with many curved legs. That's a millipede, Rick said. I'm just an ignorant botanist, but I know these guys make cyanide. Erica moaned. Don't. It's a very big animal. It's dangerous. Rick chuckled. A millipede. He turned to Karen King. Hey, Karen. What's the behavior of this animal when it's threatened? Karen King smiled. Millipedes. They are scaredy cats. Wait. Are you sure it's not a centipede? Denny quavered, remembering that Peter had said a centipede can deliver a nasty sting. Nah, this baby isn't any centipede. King said, kneeling and looking under the leaf. Centipedes are predators. A millipede doesn't eat meat. It eats rotten leaves, she explained. It's a peaceful animal. Doesn't even have a sting. What? I thought. Rick hauled the leaf off the millipede, revealing it. The millipede lay curled up and seemingly asleep. It was a cylindrical animal with segmented armor and at least 100 legs. In relation to the microhumans, the millipede appeared about 15 feet long, akin to the biggest boa constrictors. It breathed gently, making whistling noises through holes in its carapace. A millipede's version of snoring. Rick drew his machete. "Wake up," he cried, and slapped the millipede with the flat of the blade. The animal thrashed suddenly. The humans backed away, and the odor grew stronger. The millipede curled its body into a tight spiral, a defensive posture. Holding his nose, Rick darted forward and racked the animal again. He didn't want to hurt the millipede. He wanted to frighten it. The trick worked. A pungent smell of almonds mixed with a nasty, bitter stench filled the air, and blobs of an oily liquid oozed from pores in the millipede's armor. Rick opened a clean plastic jar and quickly put on his gloves, apron, and goggles. The millipede wasn't going anywhere. It remained curled up, apparently frightened. Wearing his gear, Rick advanced and scooped some of the liquid into the jar until he collected about a cup of the stuff. "It's an oil. It's full of cyanide," he explained. He dumped the oil into the jar that held his Kara goo and stirred the mess with a stick. "I scared the cyanide out of the poor bastard," he said, holding up the jar of Kara, which reeked of lethal chemicals. "And now," he added, "it's time to start hunting." Chapter 20. Nanogen Headquarters, 29 October, 4:00 p.m. Vindrake stood before a window that looked into the tensor core. The window was bulletproof, and it gave the scene in the chamber the appearance of a fish tank. Inside the chamber, the hexagons of the size translation tubes were set flush with the plastic floor. Two men walked around the core, Telius and Johnstone. They were suiting up. They put on segments of lightweight Kevlar armor, vests, arm coverings, greaves for the legs. The armor was tough enough to turn away the jaws of a soldier ant. Each man carried a .600 caliber express gas rifle. The gun was powered by a pressurized gas tank. It fired a heavy steel needle tipped with a broad-spectrum supertoxin. Long-range, total stopping power. The supertoxin was equally effective on insects, birds, and mammals. The gun had been designed especially for the protection of humans in the micro-world. Wait for the hexapod, Drake said. Telius nodded and searched the floor with his eyes, as if he was looking for a coin he'd dropped. Telius was a man of few words. Drake went to a door marked Restricted Area. Under the sign, there was a symbol that looked vaguely like a biohazard symbol, and a word, microhazard. This was the entry door that led from the Tensor Core directly to Project Omicron. No sign on the door advertised its name, of course. Drake took up a hand controller, a device that looked a little like a video game control, and punched a code into it. This disarmed the bots inside the Omicron zone, and he entered a cluster of small, windowless labs with his own special access to the Tensor Core. Nobody was permitted inside Omicron except for a handful of top Nanogen engineers. In fact, few of the Nanogen employees were even supposed to know of the existence of Omicron. Inside the rooms, several lab benches stood about, and on the benches sat a series of objects draped in black cloth shrouds. The shrouds concealed the objects. Whatever they were secret. Even people permitted to enter the Omicron zone were not allowed to look at them. Drake took a shroud off one of the objects. It was a robot with 6 legs, and it vaguely resembled a Mars robot lander, or possibly a metal insect. It was not very big, about a foot across. Drake carried the 6-legged robot back into the Tensor Core and handed it to Johnstone. Your transportation. It's got a full charge. Quad micro-lithiums. We're good, Johnstone mumbled. He was chewing something. God damn it, Drake barked. What's in your mouth? Energy bar, sir. You get so hungry. You know the rule. No eating in the core. You could contaminate the generator. Sorry, sir. It's okay. Just swallow it. Drake clapped the man on the shoulder in a friendly way. A little bit of mercy goes a long way with people who work for you. Telius placed the 6-legged device into Hexagon 3. The 2 men stood in Hexagons 2 and 1. Drake went into the control room. He would operate the generator himself. He had cleared all employees out of the core. Nobody could see him shrinking these men and this equipment. That would be a loose detail. He programmed Hexagon 3 to shrink the walker somewhat less than the humans would be shrunk, just as he had locked down and started to initiate the sequence. Don Michele came into the control room behind him. Drake and Michele watched together as the generator hummed and the power structures under the floor ramped up and the hexagons descended. After the men had been shrunk, Drake placed the microhumans in a transport box, and he put the hexapod in another box. He handed the boxes to Don Michele. Let's just hope the rescue succeeds. Let's hope, Michele replied. It was dangerous enough that Peter and the rest knew he had murdered Eric. But Drake also worried that Eric might have shared with his brother a very sensitive fact about Drake's activities that could not be made public, and that Peter might have passed it on to the other students. This particular fact, if it were known, could destroy Nandigin's business. It was just business, nothing personal, only logic. Just what had to be done in order to keep the business moving. Had Don Michele figured anything out? Drake couldn't be sure quite what the security man thought or knew. Drake gave his security chief a sharp sidelong glance. How many ground floor shares do you own? 2, sir. I'm giving you 2 more shares. Michele's expression didn't change. Thank you. Don Michele had just made $2 million on this conversation. The man would keep his mouth shut. Chapter 21. Fern Gully, 29 October, 4:00 p.m. Be quiet and don't move. They have keen eyesight and sharp hearing. Erica Mole was speaking. She was looking up into the branches of a mamaki plant, which extended some distance over their heads, unfolding large lobed leaves. Clinging to a leaf was an enormous creature, a ringed insect. The animal shone with brilliant greens, and its body was enclosed by a pair of lacy greens wings that looked like leaves. The animal had long antennae, bulging eyes, jointed legs, and a bloated abdomen, visibly packed with fat. They could hear a faint hiss sounds as it breathed, the air flowing in and out of a line of holes in its flanks. It was a katydid. Rick took one of the blowgun tubes he had made and balanced it on his shoulder. He fitted a dart into the tube. The steel tip had a glob of sticking poison smeared on it, wafting a smell of bitter almonds and nastiness. Rick's Kara, a wisp of mattress stuffing, which Rick had taken from Station Echo, was fastened to the butt of the dart. Rick knelt and brought the tube to his lips, being exceedingly careful not to get any Kara in his mouth. The cyanide made his eyes water, and his throat felt tight. "Where's the heart?" he whispered to Erica Mole, who crouched beside him. She would direct his shot, for she knew insects' anatomy best. The heart? Its posterior dorsal to the metathorax, Erica said. Rick grimaced at Erica. Huh? Erica smiled, just under the top of the animal's back. Rick shook his head. Can't make the shot. The rings are covering the area. He aimed at the tube this way and that, and finally decided on a gut shot. He took aim at the animal's lower abdomen, took a deep breath, and fired. The dart sank deep into the katydid. The creature gasped and shivered its rings. For a moment, they thought it would take off and fly, but it didn't. The animal let out a deafening shriek, an ear-splitting cry. Was it a cry of alarm? Of pain? Its breathing sped up, and it sagged and slipped, and dangled from the edge of the leaf. Emma cringed. Watching this, he had never realized how the suffering of an insect could affect him. Rick's cry was very powerful. They waited. The katydid now dangled upside down. Its breathing slowed. The hiss dragging out and sounding raspy. Then its breathing stopped. Shortly afterward, the katydid fell to the ground. Nice work, Rick. Rick the hunter. At first, the dead katydid didn't seem appealing to anyone except Erica Mole. I ate some termites once in Tanzania. They were quite delicious, Erica said. People in Africa considered insects a delicacy. Danny Minot sat down on a twig, feeling sick. He felt like he might have heaved just looking at the dead bug. Maybe we'll find a burger joint around here, he said, trying to make a joke. Insect meat is not as bad as hamburger, Emma said. Mashed muscle, blood, and connective tissues of a bovine mammal really grosses me out. I will not eat a cow. But a katydid, well, maybe. As they stared at the dead animal, their hunger grew sharper and more insistent. The small bodies had been burning energy at a high rate. They simply had to eat. Had to. Their hunger overcame their squeamishness. They butchered the katydid with machetes, while Erica guided them through the anatomy. As they pulled out meat and organs, Erica insisted that everything edible be washed in water. The animal's blood, the hemolymph, was a transparent yellow-green liquid, and it dripped out as they cracked open its armor. They removed the legs, cutting through the tough bioplastic to get at the meat inside the legs. The upper rear legs, once split open, revealed masses of lean right muscle. They sliced steaks out of the largest parts of the legs. The animal's blood might contain toxins from the dart, and so the meat had to be washed. But after they'd dipped and rinsed the flesh in dewdrops, it smelled clean and delicious. They ate the meat raw. It had a mild sweet flavor. Not bad, Rick said. Tastes like sushi. Really fresh, Karen said. Even Danny began eating the meat. gingerly at first, but with increasingly gusto, until he was cramming Katydid's steak into his mouth. Needs salt, he mumbled. The fat of the animal, soft and yellowish, oozed out of the abdomen. The abdominal fat is good for you, I'm sure, Erica said. When none of them would try it, she scooped some fat out with her hands and ate it raw. It's sweet, she said. Slightly nutty taste. Their bodies craved the fat, and soon they all dug into the Katydid's abdomen, scooping out the fat and gulping it down, licking their fingers. I feel like we're lions at a kill, Peter said. The Katydid yielded far more meat than they could possibly eat. They didn't want to let it go to waste, so they gathered up bundles of moist moss and wrapped some of the meat in the moss, as much as they could carry, and stuffed it down in the duffel bags to keep it cool. They ended up with enough Katydid steaks to keep them going for a while anyway. Feeling much better, they consulted the hand-drawn map. Peter had been carrying the map and had been guiding them with the compass. He pointed to features. We're right here, I think, he said, noting a cluster of tree ferns that appeared on the map. We're pretty close to Station Bravo. We might make Bravo by nightfall. He looked around and up at the sky. The light was going. It was late afternoon. Let's just hope the station is intact. Peter sighted the compass on the distant trunk of a palm tree, and they headed out, carrying the duffel bags and stopping once in a while to smell and listen for ants. Whenever they ran into an ant, they knew there would be more. As long as they moved quickly away, the ants wouldn't get too excited. The big danger was a nest entrance. As the sun began to set, shadows deepened on the forest floor, and Peter, who was leading, became more cautious about ants and more worried about stumbling into an ant's nest. But so far, so good. Stop, Peter said. He examined a mark on the stem of an Ilia plant, growing up from the ground like a miniature tree. The stem had been cut with 3 V-shaped notches, and above them was splashed an X made of orange paint. It was ablaze. They had come to a trail. Peter advanced and found another orange X sprayed on a pebble. The trail proceeded onward. A faint disturbance of the soil marked with blazes at points along the way. Minutes later, he stopped at the edge of a large ragged hole in the ground. The soil around it had been dug up and turned over. Around the hole, giant footprints were impressed in the ground. The footprints had filled with water, like swimming pools. Peter consulted the map. We're at Station Bravo, he said, but there's no station. The footprints told a story. Somebody had dug the station out of the ground and taken it away. We have to assume the worst, Karen King said, taking off her backpack and sitting down by the hole. She wiped her brow. This is Vindrake's work. It means he knows or suspects we are still alive. He's taking away our means of survival. So Drake could be hunting for us, Peter said. But how would he find us? Rick wondered. It's a good question. Their bodies less than an inch tall would not be easily noticed by a normal-sized person. Radio silence is essential now, Peter said. The disappearance of Station Bravo meant that they had no place to hide during the hours of darkness. The sun was setting and night was coming on fast, as it does in the tropics. Erica was becoming increasingly alarmed as she watched the sun go down. Just to point out, she said to the others, the vast majority of insects come out at night, not during the day. And many of them are predators. We need to make a bivouac, Peter said. We are going to build a fort. Not far away, a hexapod walker vehicle strode rapidly across the first floor, climbing over pebbles and pushing leaves aside, its 6 legs working with seemingly boundless energy. Motors on the legs whined. Johnstone's was driving, his hand sunk in a glove-like device. Our hand controller, while he watched the readouts told him the levels of power the servo motors were delivering to the vehicle's 6 legs. Telius sat next to him in the open cockpit, his eyes tracking left and right, up and down. Both men wore full body armor. The walker was powered by a nanolaminate micro-lithium power pack. It had a long range and plenty of power. Regular vehicles didn't work well in the micro world. They got stuck. The wheels spun uselessly. Wheeled vehicles couldn't climb over obstacles either. Instead, the Nanogen's engineers had copied the design of an insect. The design worked extremely well. The walker arrived at a hole in the ground. Stop, Telius said. Johnstone brought the vehicle to a halt and stared into the hole. That's Echo. Was, Telius corrected him. Both men leaped out of the vehicle, in soaring jumps, their armor clattering. They landed on their feet. They had a lot of practice at physical movement in the micro world, and they knew how to use their strength. They began circling around the hole, examining moss, crumbs of dirt. The rain earlier in the day had obliterated most traces of the students' passage across the surface. But Johnstone's knew that clues remained. He could track anybody anywhere. A growth of moss on a rock attracted his attention. He went up to it and studied it. The moss stood waist high. He touched a narrow stalk that came up out of the moss. It was a spore stalk with a broken spore capsule at the end of it. The stalk was bent at a right angle, broken, and spores had spilled out. some of them clinging to the moss and the sticky fluff of wet spore granules. Telius found the imprint of a human hand. Somebody had grabbed the spore stalk, broken it, spilled the pollen, then put their hands in it. Farther on, Telius found a confused set of human footprints clambering over a lump of dirt in a spot under a spreading leaf that had protected the ground underneath from rain splashes. Johnstone knelt and examined the footprints. There's 5 of them. No, 6. Walking in a line. He looked off, heading southeast. What's southeast? Telius said. Parking lot. Johnstone narrowed his eyes and smiled. Telius looked at him quizzically. Johnstone picked a mite off his shoulder plate, crushed it, flicked it away. Fucking mites. Now we know their plan. What plan? They're looking for a ride back to Nanogen. He was right, obviously. Telius nodded and began walking swiftly ahead. Following clues, Johnstone jumped back into the hexapod and began driving it, following Telius as he moved swiftly ahead of the walker, often leaping over things, traveling at a pace somewhere between a dog trot and a flat-out run. Occasionally, Telius stopped to examine tracks in the soft soil. The targets hadn't made any effort to cover the tracks. They didn't suspect they were being followed. But it was starting to get dark. Telius and Johnstone knew enough about the microworld to know they needed to go to the ground for the night. You do not move after dark. Not ever. They stopped the hexapod. Johnstone ran an electric shock cable in a circle around the vehicle, staking the cable into the ground, chest high, while Telius dug a foxhole directly underneath the vehicle. They energized the power cable from the capacitor. They would deliver a shock to any animal that touched it, and they hunkered down in the foxhole, sitting back to back, holding their .600 expresses propelled at their sides, loaded and ready for action. Telius leaned back and put a dip of snuff under his lip. Johnstone took the radio locator with him into the foxhole, so that he could listen for any radio transmissions during the night. Johnstone wasn't worried. This was his 10th trip into the microworld, and he knew what he was doing. He turned on the locator and watched the screen, looking for signs of any radio transmissions in the 70 gigahertz band, the frequency used by the Nanogen headsets. He saw no signs of radio chatter. They may not even have radios, he said to Telius. Telius grunted in response and spat a jet of tobacco. They ate packaged meals. They got up to urinate separately, one man going off a few paces, while the other man kept his partner covered with a gas rifle, just in case something tried to attack through the electrified wire. Some of those bastards out there could smell you when you took a piss. Afterward, they traded watches, one man dozing, while the others stayed on lookout. The lookout wore infrared goggles, his eyes just above the level of the ground. Johnstones couldn't get over how damn lively this world was at night. In his IR goggles, he saw constant, ceaseless movements of small creatures going about their damn business. Bugs. A million bugs crawling everywhere. He didn't even know what they were. Seen one bug, you've seen them all. As long as they weren't some kind of predator. He watched for the warm shape of a mouse. He wanted to shoot some big game tonight. Dropping a mouse with a .600 Express was as good as shooting a Cape buffalo, which he'd done a few times in Africa. I'd like to blow away a mouse, Johnstone said. That would be fun. Telius grunted. I just don't want to meet a fucking Skolo, Johnstones added.